The great burden, though, I feel like, of this life, what generates real regret and depression, despair, which, yes, in Christian tradition, we're counseled not to fall into. It's actually like a vice to be in despair.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's still too heavy. That's just to increase the burden if you don't include with that the prospect of undoing the source of despair,
Right.
even if it looks to you like it's done and gone
Yeah.
and over, and it's
Yeah.
just past. And I'm not sure that would be possible were it not for the fact that God could become a timeful creature and remain eternal, so that in Christ himself, eternity and time are one,
Mm.
which means that he himself becomes the bridge from one moment to all other moments.
Yeah.
So now all moments on the timeline open up to all other ones in a way that as a timeline wouldn't be possible. It's barely conceivable. So in other words, to put it in MacDonald's terms, and he does this sometimes, but I think he mostly goes because it's easier to grasp. He plays with space, spaces overlapping, two objects overlapping. There's a great line though where I love this. Mr. Vane says, "Here I was in a world, and if two objects could be in the same place at the same time, why not 10 or 20 or 1,000?"
Yes.
And then he said, that paragraph ends with just, "I decided not to think any further."
Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holzer. Derek here. The Plunge publishes extended conversations on theology, philosophy, and culture, featuring guests who enliven and inspire with timely discussions of the timeless. Our aspiration is that these conversations will fill humanity with greater hope, courage, and peace as we celebrate goodness, beauty, and truth. And we explore the very real possibility that if we imagine better, we can make our world better. Joining me today is a frequent guest and good friend, Dr. Jordan Daniel Wood, Assistant Professor of Theology at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. Jordan is the author of The Whole Mystery of Christ, Creation as Incarnation in Maximus Confessor, and his essays can be found on his Substack, Words and Flesh, at jordandanielwood.substack.com. He can also be found on X, formerly Twitter, at Jordan W41069857. In this episode, which is part 7 of our series inspired by George MacDonald's novel Lilith, which I've entitled Jesus is the Multiverse, we explore the beginning of life, death, and the interconnectedness of all things, including time and space, with their creator. I hope you'll find some thought-provoking and even soul-healing ideas within this hour. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Jordan Daniel Wood, for once again being willing to take the plunge.
So, death and sleep, and symbolism and meaning and reality. Before that, there's a couple of interesting juxtapositions, I'm not sure if that's the right word, where the character, Mr. Vane, he comes through first, and Adam or Mr. Raven, Sexton, whichever character it is guiding him, kind of encourages him to go to sleep, and he refuses. And then he has a change of heart, comes back, and wants to, and is not permitted to. And so I'm just curious about what you make of that, because on the one hand, you have, again, we've said the librarian, Raven, Sexton, Adam figure, almost in the first part, prematurely trying to encourage Mr. Vane to do something before it's time. Mm-hmm. And then when Mr. Vane thinks he's ready, he's told he's not yet.
Right.
What do you make of that?
Yeah. So, it's so interesting because on the one hand, sometimes Mr. Raven and his wife, they can come across as almost like all-knowing seers it's almost akin to like the angel guiding the Apostle John to the apocalypse. It's like, I'm going to show you how everything is. They've got this knowledge. They try to make themselves understood, but Mr. Vane's struggling. So it does strike you at first as like, why did they not know that? They know all these other things. How do they not know he's not ready? And it is interesting too, because the wife, who's sort of a Eve figure, hazy figure there, but she does seem a little more hesitant too. It's almost like she knows a little more. But then I think, okay, So you get into kind of the logic of personal development a little bit, because it's like, okay, it looks like they initially sort of prematurely forced it, didn't work. He goes back. But that does bring him to his own realization, which is that he did something wrong. He wasn't sufficiently open to what they were saying. He kept sort of attributing, like, oh, they're insane, or like, this is a weird world, or I just want to get out of here, you know? So in a way, there was still progress made in his own personal development. So what looked like a premature closure also sort of was the thing that spurred him on to the next. And now I'm going to repent. And now I've realized something about myself. Then when he goes back during that conversation where the Raven's a little harsher, he learns other things like, oh, actually your father was there.
Right.
And then he's like, well, what in the world here? Like, what's going on here? And also your great-grandfather. In fact, this one's been, your great-grandfather's been gone for a long time. And so it's an interesting question, what was and what wasn't necessary for Mr. Vane to progress.
Mm-hmm.
Is it obviously the case that he could have done without the quote-unquote premature taking him to the end? I don't know. Maybe he needed that, in which case it wasn't premature.
Yeah.
It was actually precisely the right thing, and there's also another part of me that sees in kind of the symbolism here that he's immediately taken to the end, as it were, first, which in a sense gives him a better notion, even if it's an implicit one and a hazy one he still has to work out and come to clear perception of, on the rest of his journey. Because then Mr. Raven sends him out on his journey alone, more or less. Like, hey, you can go towards the evil woods, and there are people that are kind of creatures that are like you, which is interesting because it ends up being the little ones, those children who are very childlike, but also kind of in a state of ignorance. But that's in a sense of already a progression or an improvement or an advancement upon Mr. Vane's initial starting point, which was, I know how things are.
Right.
So now he's reduced to ignorance and repentance, but he's frustrated again. But that becomes the engine for his journey.
Uh-huh.
And then when he meets them, the ones he's like, which are like a child who is kind of cleared away you're less confident in your own delusions, but you also still don't know. Just like they don't really know, but they're becoming good, but without knowledge. So all this looks to me like, so in other words, if you abstract it and say, what's the process that a person has to go through to reach the end? Then that can all look sort of jolted and maybe out of order or something. But then if you say, but maybe Mr. Vane himself needed that order, then it's precisely an order.
Right.
So it's one of those like,
do not kick against the goads.
Exactly right. Exactly. What Saul needed, Stephen didn't.
Yes.
Or end of Gospel of John, right? Is he going to live to the end? Yeah.
Right?
What is it to you? Was it to you if I let him, live to the end? And all that is like the work of divine providence. And it's this sort of, he does know and he's working in all things, and we trust that, or we don't. And even our mistrust is itself a kind of sign of a certain misapprehension or misjudgment or an error or deception or delusion that we have to be disabused of. And that's a part of our process.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, I think what looked premature kind of in retrospect looks kind of maybe fitting for Mr. Vane. It does actually progress him, moves him to a different state of receptivity. But then I also think there's something about he got a glimpse of the end, which was itself almost the condition or the beginning of his going towards the end. He needed that. He needed to see it in order to know where he was going in a determinate enough way to make his way. But Mr. Raven also knows a part of his essential to his journey is to make his own way. He's resistant. And in this way, I just want to throw this out there at the end. Mr. Vane and Lilith, they're very different, but they're on the same continuum. They struggle with the same things. They both don't like to be violated. They both want to own themselves in total autonomy. They both think they know what's true of the world and themselves. And they both have to be broken down slowly in order to be reconstructed. And so, that's so I think Mr. Raven is treating each according to exactly what they need.
I love it. Now, death and sleep. So we have this, as you said, I love what you said earlier, cosmic cemetery, right? This vast repository of ostensibly sleeping figures, and until their time to as sort of butterflies come out of the cocoon, they lay there.
Right, exactly.
And Mr. Vane is invited to join them, and ultimately Lilith is invited to join them. right? Speak to the notion of the death, sleep, and the parallels, the symbolism that's pretty rife throughout all cultures and literature and art, but maybe more spiritually, theologically. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So we can start here. I mean, death is an inherently ambiguous thing for a Christian because, on the one hand, 1 Corinthians 15 is the last enemy. Death, or like if you're a Catholic or Orthodox and you have in your Bible the Book of Wisdom, God did not create death. Or other parts of the Old Testament, God does not delight in the death of the wicked. Christ trampled death by death. Death is thrown in to the lake of fire, death and Hades.
Yeah.
So all these things tell us, on the one hand, that death is anti-God, anti-creation. It's something to be overcome, not something to make your peace with in a nice, again, rational, self-enclosed system where it's like, hey, it's the circle of life. It's all sort of a part of it. It's like, okay, so it's just this endless circle of life and death. No, it's like the Christian faith in the resurrection of Jesus is that death has been trampled down. It's destroyed. It's overcome. It's conquered. And that's the overcoming of the world through Christ. So on the one hand, you have death as enemy, antagonist. On the other hand, because Christ died, and what happens after is the resurrection, then your death is in another way similar to your entrance into true life, almost like true birth.
Right.
So there's this sense of the thing that is at once the enemy is also the only way that you have to go through it, like a portal or a door, in order to transcend it. And so I think Christians in general just already recognize this inherent ambiguity. There's other things too, just interpersonally and stuff. There's a sense of when someone dies, it's a tragedy. Some people do celebrations of life, which is great, but you're not really celebrating their death. You're not celebrating their absence. And in the end, everything was present to everything else. So again, the ambiguity reemerges. On the one hand, you celebrate the life. You're glad they exist. They're a gift to you. God gave them existence. The relationship itself was enriching, and it's wonderful, and it's a source of delight. On the other hand, it's now gone. So what is it? Are you celebrating? Or are you, right? So there's this kind of inherent ambiguity that I don't think is you just can't really get around it if you're thinking Christianly about death. So when MacDonald thinks about it, I think there's an added paradox. It's not just, is death good or bad, or is it a good or a bad? And actually, I should just say on the side that even in the Christian tradition, there's wildly different views of death. You'll have St. Ambrose giving a whole oration called On the Good of Death. And then you have St. Augustine in the Confessions saying something way more ambiguous about death and crying when his mother died. So even though she was saying this is good. Yeah, so he's not totally sure she's right. So anyway, there's all these moments like that in the tradition. I think the other layer, though, the other paradoxical layer in this imagery that this room full of sleeping dead corpses that are still slightly alive and they're cold and the moon is shining on them, and yet their faces, the light doesn't stay on their faces, which is interesting. Again, I think a resonance to their faces are still they're still emerging. So with some of the later Lewis stuff is the added dimension is that this life, which is headed towards sleep or death, in the New Testament they're equated at certain moments, like fallen asleep, your brethren who have fallen asleep. At the same time, is, again, while it looks like our end from our perspective, is in a certain sense our only true beginning. And that's shot through even through Christian ritual, right? When you're baptized, is that a death or a birth? Kind of both?
Both and.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's the death of, and that speaks to the fundamental sort of division within us that sin itself creates, because the old man has to be destroyed. Right. So there's a death, annihilation. Yeah. But then that is also the birth of the new man, of Christ in you, right? I'm at labor until Christ is formed in you. So birth and death are inextricably linked in this life. And I think that goes all the way to the end. And what MacDonald is doing is saying, again, it's playing with being and becoming, or being in freedom, that we were talking about earlier, which is that line, again, where Mr. Raven's wife says that you must first rest before you can do anything. And she says, humans forget that that every day begins in sleep. And they keep referring to like what I would maybe want to call the general resurrection as the great morning of the universe to come. So the dawn. The dawn is not yet here. And of course, Christ's resurrection is on the dawn of the eighth day. And there's the eighth day motif, which is the only true day, the only true reality. And so I think what's going on here is that this life that we're currently living is our formation for living.
Right.
And so the paradox is built in is that you have to first be alive before you can freely assent to living, but also your free assent to life itself through death and resurrection is your true birth.
Yeah.
And so I think what you have there is a wonderful image for all of that wrapped up into one, because, and this explicitly said in the text, is he says, I want to say they were sleeping, but that's not right. There's something deeper going on here. And I think that's the point. There's something deeper because it's all kind of happening in one.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're lying down there. They look dead, but also Mr. Vane keeps being told they're more awake than you are.
Right.
But he thinks they're just asleep or dead.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, he admits that he sees that the sorrows have been, quote, charmed away. What I think is going on is that every single person, in order to truly be born, they have to, right back, there's no path except through you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's totally unique and individual as you are. So it's a kind of ultimate privacy. So they're asleep. What work are they doing?
Yeah.
What dreams are they having?
And maybe even, I would say, ultimate intimacy with God and the human, right?
Yeah. And it's really interesting because at one point, Mr. Vane says something like, talks about the moon, being cold on them and they're cold. And Mr. Raven says, actually, they're the ones making it cold. So the coldness is coming from them, which feels to me like they're doing the work of what I'd call divine judgment, which is working through the deepest parts of their soul and their life that they've lived, which was itself the initial expression of their freedom and their becoming truly created. And they're working through it, and as they do, they're dealing with the pain, the sorrow, the tragedy, the growth, and they're pushing it to the surface. And that's coming out as coldness, but it's being expelled. So actually what's happening is they're being enlivened from within.
Yeah.
And some of that comes through with other descriptions, right, of certain corpses or certain people lying there. They're paler than others. Sometimes they look more ruddy. So it's all this deep, private, spiritual work happening in dreams, which has the added benefit of asking, so the life we're currently living, is that waking or is that sleeping, right? And it's this wonderful duality and paradox is just shot through the whole thing.
Yeah, and he gets to choose if he wants to unplug from the matrix.
Exactly right, exactly. And that's the point, right? I mean, to our earlier conversation, you can choose whether or not you want to sleep.
Yeah.
So actually, your choice, your own freedom, your own desire is what gives birth to your true birth.
Mm-hmm.
Which just seems like a paradox. Seems like you have to first be born in order to desire. Here, what it is, desire gives birth to your birth.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I want to make a remark because it's come in my head a few times. Every time you've talked about that rest before, I heard this, I can't recall who said it, but pointing out in the creation narrative with Adam and Eve, right, their first day of living was the Sabbath. They were resting, right?
A great point, yeah.
So anyway, just...
Oh, that's excellent. And then you connect that with what day of the week, is Christ, in the Gospel of John certainly plays it up. And of course, it's like they're in a garden. This is where the first resurrection. So it's sort of hearkening back to those, just as the first chapter of John harkened back to Genesis 1, so does the last chapter of John harken back to, or the last few chapters harken back to, the garden itself and those other few chapters. And so, yeah, exactly. And so that's the paradox. Again, this is the thing that doesn't seem possible, but in the medium of fantasy, where you don't have to follow the rules of finitude, as it were.
Yes.
You can have perichoresis of places. You can have perichoresis of activities, even of worlds. At one point, he even says the worlds, do they interpenetrate each other? He says, because he seems to go back from the world, but then immediately when the raven shows up, it's actually the other world, and he doesn't know where one begins and the other ends. So there's a sense, and then also there's that sense then of which one is the dream of the other. It's almost like getting to the movie Inception, which one's the dream of the other, and also isn't there a sense then that wherever those people that are sleeping, wherever they're getting, whatever truly waking is even more than either of those worlds. It's not like just another event in the fantasy world. It's the perfection of the two as one, which of course is the scene you get at the end.
Well, before we jump to the end, the title character Lilith.
Yes,
I just want to run through her journey with you. And the first thing that struck me, that the first time I read the book, the scene that gripped me is when Vane encounters her in the field and thinks she's dead, and the interaction between them. So he comes across, and prior to it, he's expressed loneliness, right? He's just kind of following the moon, and he's left behind, I believe, the land of the babies and the giants, and we don't have time to cover them. I'll cover those with another guest on this series. But he comes across her, and there is this almost sensual interplay, like the need for human contact and connection is so powerful that he basically is nurturing a corpse, as though it's a friend. I don't know if you've ever read Cormac McCarthy's Child of God, but it's definitely rated R plus. Any of the listeners, it's about a character who ultimately gives in to relationships with the dead because he has no one else. It's very profound insight into human need and longing. In this case, in Lilith, this process by which he revives her, I guess my question is, what do you think MacDonald is saying about Lilith herself, that she's in that state? Was that her setting a trap to sort of siphon off of him, etc.?
It's a great question. I think at least two things come to mind. I think it is on the one hand an admission that she can't even sustain her own existence apart from someone else. But then on the other hand, that means that Lilith is somehow just as much a result of our actions as she is of her own. So that's another great paradox in the whole book is, on the one hand, there's this real strong emphasis on individual, your path. You got to walk your way. You have to come to see it for yourself. You have to become true. You are the only riddle, actually. But that can at points feel almost atomistic, very individualistic. Like, okay, so really, it's like I'm on my own here. But I think at the same time, a person is that reality which is so utterly unique, but also so completely open to others, which is, of course, ultimately the good expression of that, and the perfect expression is the Trinity. Father is not the Father without the Son, but also they're just so different that the Son was crucified, not the Father, and the Spirit raised from the dead. So persons are the conjunction of total uniqueness with total openness to others. Mutual constitution, perichoresis. Now, the failure to live up to that still retains that structure, that logical structure, that intersubjective structure, even in its corruption. So I make Lilith just as much as Lilith makes me who I am right now, and there is this weird dependence. Vampiric, exactly.
Codependent dysfunction.
It's very vampiric. That, of course, plays out in our own existence in very obvious ways. Codependency, mutual destruction. We've all known or even been a part of relationships that are destroying both at once. Maybe in totally different ways, but weirdly compatible ways. So this is interesting. The interesting part there is that the deep seat of that is something true. You can't be who you are without everyone else. But but there are many ways that goes wrong. And yet, even in its failure, it retains the structure of its perfection. So I think, so the question then is, so the answer almost becomes both and. Was it a trap? Yes, but isn't it kind of a trap that Vane wanted? And isn't him giving his life, like literally in this case, giving his blood, giving his life for her life, isn't that also just as much, as it were, complicity in sustaining her as she is, rather than helping her get beyond who she is, right? So it's like an anti-Trinitarian, it's like an anti-Christological manifestation, but you can only say anti-Trinitarian, anti-Christological exactly, because it still has that structure even in its corruption. And also the other note here, just sort of in the background of like Christian tradition, is that this is a very old way of talking about evil. Evil isn't just, and it's mostly in monastic literature. Evil isn't just the failure for good to come out, but it's parasitic. There's actually, Maximus describes it as para hypostasis, alongside and around the hypostasis, the person, drawing, as it were, life. But evil itself is a delusion. Yet you can give your life, you can literally give yourself almost in an act of self-sacrifice to bring about the illusion in reality. So I might think of myself in a certain way, but my self-portrait is false.
Yeah.
And yet I can kind of successfully bring it into existence. And I can even make you start responding to it. Do you know who I am?
Yeah. Yeah.
You should treat me this way.
Yep.
You should not have said that or whatever. And now my world is actually starting to rearrange and start to reflect my image of myself, which is yet at base totally false, or let's say mostly false. And so that image, I think, of mutual dependence, but of a corrupt, corrosive, and destructive sort, is kind of what's going on there. And so I really would want to say kind of both are true.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So continuing with Lilith herself, I just, again, my questions are quite open-ended. So there's some shape-shifting that happens.
Yeah.
And there's a leopard, and there's apparently two different people that can turn into feline figures. Just what is your read on sort of that shape-shifting dynamic and takeaway?
I think a similar, actually, it really does sort of, it's like in a development of what we were just talking about with the vampiric, the mutual dependence, because again, shape-shifting is how she appears to me.
Mm-hmm.
She seems to me different right now. Just like the Raven has his own shape-shifting. He appears to me this way, but then he turns around and he's this sexton, this librarian. And so I think very often MacDonald is playing with this idea. It's a kind of idealist idea, but there's roots in the Christian monastic tradition that what appears to you is just as much a result of you as it is something that's just external to you that you run into.
Yeah.
And so you constitute the appearance, the phenomenon. And that's what I would say from my work is that's evidence, as it were, that creation itself is incarnation. It's an ongoing process of incarnation. The Word wants to be incarnate in all things, as Maximus thinks. But also that means it can go falsely because it's also cooperative with you. And so if Lilith is a mutual construction, I'm just as complicit in Lilith being Lilith as she is in me being me. But at the same time, too, even the very way she appears to me is as it were a sort of mirror or a perception or window into me. I'm almost projecting it. The good way MacDonald does this, like especially in the fairy tales, is he'll pick up the Platonic image of light coming from your eyes rather than light hitting things and then coming to your eyes, like we would understand it physically. That was an idea Plato had, that you see things because your eyes actually shoot light out, and then it hits it and comes back to you, and then you see it. And we don't quite understand it that way now.
MacDonald has that character. I believe it's Princess Incurdy.
Exactly.
His love lit her up in the darkness.
Changes what appears to him.
Yeah.
But it's because it's a part of him.
Yeah.
So you even constitute what appears to you. So what's external to you is just as much something as a result of something internal to you.
Yeah.
And so that idea, that Platonic idea, which sort of run through the literary and Christian sort of genres, is that even Lilith can shapeshift, because even the way I perceive evil or the way it appears to me is something I just as much contribute to. But I think there's other things too. I mean, the fact that she can shapeshift is a sign of that she's not substantial. So she can take on different forms. There's no boundaries in the good sense. She's not transcending boundaries, she's mutating.
Yeah.
She's not transcending, she's mutating. And so that's a sign of corruption as well, of the lack of integrity, the lack of security, fear. So I'm going to change based on my circumstances, chameleon sort of thing. So I think that's going on as well. Yeah, Satan can come as disguised as an angel of light.
Right.
So Satan can shapeshift. So certainly Lilith, sort of the high satanic character of the novel, is going to be able to as well.
Yeah. And yet, regardless of the shape she takes, that black spot
exactly
on the side
is always there.
marks her.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the individuality is never expunged.
Yes.
And that is also then the sign of her ultimate hope.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
The flaw is the indicator of that there's a true self under there
Absolutely.
to be born.
And of course, you can run that straight to, you can turn that into a mirror. You can say, no matter what I make myself out to be, there's like to borrow from sacramental theology, there's like an indelible mark on you.
Yeah.
Where, and then again, another resonance, the mark of Cain.
Right.
Is also the mark of his salvation, because even in the narrative of Genesis 4, it protects him. So there's so many nice resonances on that. Yeah.
So good. So there's a couple more little parts here. Mara.
Yeah.
Is a character that comes, and trying to recall, Mara is Lilith's daughter. Is that the way you read it?
Yeah, I think so. I have to actually.
Yeah,
that was a little hazy to me, and then I didn't review it.
Yeah, but regardless, Mara comes to guide and support that process with Adam and Eve, and it seems as though the scene that we have for those of you joining us is Adam and Eve at the end. Lilith has arrived. She has her fist clenched, right? Not knowing whether there's something in there, whether it's just symbolic of that individual pride, my way, my will. And Adam seems to be the most compassionate. Eve is not as much. And then this Mara figure arrives and kind of does the same. And my thought, I guess I wanted to ask your thought, if you thought that Mara kind of is a symbolic of this Holy Spirit. I don't know.
I think two things. This is, I of course, because so much of the imagery is multi-layered and right. We have Adam, Sexton, Library, Christ. I read Mara as at once sort of Holy Spirit and Mary. There's so many famous parallelisms between Eve and Mary. Mary is this, she's the mother. Whereas Mary or Eve comes from Adam, but now the new Adam comes from Mary, right? So there's this, again, reversal, this sort of inversion. And so I think also, though, like, it gives her kind of this, on the one hand, Lilith is, like, she's sort of the daughter of Lilith, but also now she's through this process of judgment, as it were, mothering her. Almost like almost bringing her to true birth, which is the sleep. Right. Which she needs in order to really be born. And so now daughter has become mother, right? And so I love that sense, but of course all of that, like you're saying, is the work of the Spirit. The Spirit is the only one that can invert things that seem to us logically necessary in a sequence. It seems like I got to live before I could be free, but in the Spirit, you're free in order that you can be born. It seems like when the end of my life is death, but actually the Spirit makes death the beginning of your life, which is resurrection. Right, so there's a constant, the Spirit is the third in the Trinity, but actually without the Spirit, there is no Trinity at all. And so it's a kind of, in its own way, the end and beginning of the Godhead.
Yeah.
So the Spirit is constantly playing with, presupposing, as it were, or assuming as the condition, sequences that seem absolute to us, but it makes it in its perfection. And the end that the Spirit is simultaneously the beginning, which is what allows us to have the space, the fantasy world, which is kind of also this world, to have the space to become truly born, to have the space to play with our freedom and maybe even tragically misuse it, but that tragedy not become a permanent feature of the whole. Mm-hmm. That's the work of resurrection. Mm-hmm. That's the work of putting evil or good where evil was.
Yeah.
That's the work of judgment.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I like that connection as well. I like Mara as spirit. As inverting all that through the process of divine judgment. So she's the one, it makes sense to me on that level that she's the one kind of conducting it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then also as Eve, because of course, ultimately what is salvation but the word of God being born through you.
Right.
So she's making, to use Maximus's terms again, she's making every soul a virgin mother.
Yeah.
The Theotokos.
I love it.
So yeah, that's some thoughts on Mara, but there's so much more.
Yes. Well, and you've referenced this a few times, not just in this conversation, but the idea that tragedy is not left as a monument, right, in the past. Right. And I'm going to diverge just briefly because there's a thread that you continually pluck as a beautiful note, and that is with respect to our perception of time.
Yeah. And
this is Maximus in your work and in your I think it's your own personal beliefs at this point. That time dynamic and God not getting one linear shot. I just love that and appreciate that.
No, that's because I think that's a great burden on us.
Mm-hmm.
Heidegger, to bring in a name we probably didn't expect to mention in these conversations, when he describes the condition of the human being, Dasein, when he calls it sort of the human being in a way, as the condition of being thrown in.
Mm-hmm.
That's his term. We're thrown into existence. It's got that sense that we all the way back to the first conversation of like, yeah, you really are just thrown in the midst. And for the first several chapters of my life, I don't know what the point is. I don't know if there is a point.
Yeah.
All I have is a succession of experiences that I myself as an identity unite as one. Otherwise, it's just a random event.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but I still don't know what the point is. I also don't know who I am. There's that conversation in Lilith, right? One of the first time Vane gets a little, I think, struck, and he actually starts to sense there's something more than just insanity here. Is when Mr. Raven specifically says, "Who are you?"
Yeah, and he forgets.
Yeah, and he's like, I don't, and he's like, well, at first he comes with a false certitude. He says, well, of course I know who I am. How could I not? I am myself.
That's right.
And Mr. Raven says, okay, then tell me who you are.
Yeah.
And he has a few other wonderful lines there. But afterwards, Mr. Vane, he says, like, I immediately realized that I had no answer to him.
Yeah.
I had no way to. So all to say, right, that the great burden, though, I feel like, of this life, what generates real regret and depression, despair, which, yes, in Christian tradition, we're counseled not to fall into. It's an extreme. It's a vice. It's actually like a vice to be in despair. Mm-hmm. But I think that's still too heavy. That's just to increase the burden if you don't include with that the prospect of undoing the source of despair, right, even if it looks to you like it's done and gone.
Yeah.
And over. And it's just past. And I'm not sure that would be possible were it not for the fact that God could become a timeful creature and remain eternal, so that in Christ himself, eternity and time are one, which means that he himself becomes the bridge from one moment to all other moments.
Yeah.
So now all moments on the timeline open up to all other ones in a way that as a timeline wouldn't be possible. It's barely conceivable. So in other words, to put it in MacDonald's terms, and he does this sometimes, but I think he mostly goes because it's easier to grasp. He plays with space. Spaces overlapping, two objects overlapping. There's a great line though where I love this. Mr. Vane says, "Here I was in a world, and if two objects could be in the same place at the same time, why not 10 or 20 or 1,000?" Yes, and then he said, that paragraph ends with just, "I decided not to think any further." And what I want to say is, if that's true for space, why not time?
Yeah.
In fact, how could it not be? So I think it would be best if we think of time and moments and events as having depth, not just having extension.
I see.
Having quality, not just quantity, like tick marks on the watch. So why I say all that is not just to have some weird theory of like time that's just wacky or sort of trippy or whatever.
Yeah.
It's actually a source of hope,
yes,
because it means literally nothing that has been done can't be undone. Nothing that has occurred can't be annihilated. And what will happen in the end, just to go back to the imagery of the novel, what happens in the end is your evil, even the memory of it, will seem as unsubstantial to you as like whatever weird dream you had last night.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so as this world becomes more awake, and as you become more awake, what you initially took to be the true waking reality will actually float away into a dream world, and you will be thankful for it because it won't be real.
Right. Right.
And so you'll only ever remember it under the aspect of something that wasn't real, and that has always and everywhere and for all time, so to speak, been overcome. And so I think that can sound like a weird theological or philosophical theory of time, but to be honest, I think it suffuses even MacDonald's fantasy world.
Yes.
It's actually one of those conditions that makes his profound universalist hope possible and intelligible and actually really beautiful.
Right. So I need to personally explore it more deeply, but it rings very true to me that from the point at which we've discussed where we agree that either God is all good and in the end will make all things new. Right. If he's not that, then there's really no point. I would not, as I think David Bentley Hart says, I would not participate in this faith tradition if our God was not
exactly
that magic, majestic.
Yes.
Magical.
In its own way.
Yes. But then I think it follows logically what you've just explained about the nature of time.
Right.
Yeah.
And look, it comes back to this. Does that seem physically absurd on the... Yeah, it does. I mean, what does it mean to say something that happened can sort of unhappen, right? Yeah. But let's go back to MacDonald's fantasy world, which is not really... It's actually more real than what we call reality. That's part of the whole thing, right? There is no law but love. Who cares what you think about the limits of space and time?
Yeah.
That's not the ultimate law.
That's right. That's right. And once upon a time, people flying was a impossibility.
Exactly. I love that. There's a line actually in some other work and I think it's either a sermon or in an essay where MacDonald says, no, it's in a novel. It's actually in a novel. I think it's one of the lesser known ones. It's either Robert Falconer or What's Mine's Mine, where he says, character says, something seems incredible until it happens.
Yep. That's it.
It has only to happen.
Yes.
And then it no longer seems
it's
incredible.
Just commonplace.
I'm like, man, yes, that's right.
Exactly. Well, last question. Ultimately, so Lilith is there, clenched fist. We have Adam contending for her to yield. We have the whole conversation between Adam and Mr. Vane talking about why she hasn't relented.
Yeah.
And she claims that she can't open her hand.
Right.
That it's grown together because it's been this way so long.
Right.
And she asks Adam to cut it off for her.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious as to what is your thought of that scene, what MacDonald might mean. How does that connect to the nature of transformation, soteriology, all these concepts of Christ's work in us and our sort of surrender?
So I know this is not the only reading of this because I've had some conversations with other people and they pointed out some points that I could say, okay, it could be a different thing, but also at the end, it could mean all these things at once. Here's my reading though. The first time I read it, I thought this. When I asked myself, what's in her hand? What is she gripping? The only answer I could really come to is this. Nothing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the real absurdity of evil, is that what she is so in such greed and a sense of possession.
Yeah.
What she's grasping at ebony, grasping at the fruit. It's not, because as we know, right, what the serpent says in Genesis isn't wrong.
Right.
He says he knows you'll be like God. Well, it's like, well, in Genesis 1, that's what God said, that you are made to become like God.
Yeah.
So it's not that the goal was wrong. It's the manner. It's the acquisitiveness, the impatience, as St. Irenaeus says, the sort of impatience of the coerciveness, the sense of mastery, and domination. That's that way of becoming like God.
Yeah.
It's not just like, oh, it won't work. But the reason why it won't work is because God isn't like that. So the moment you try to grasp it the moment you try to grasp becoming like God is exactly the moment you're no longer like God.
Yeah.
Because God doesn't grasp. He didn't consider equality of God something to be grasped, but instead made himself, took him in the likeness of a servant and human being. So Christ is what God is like. So if you want to become like God, you become like Christ. And so I think Lilith has nothing in her hand. I think what she has in her hand then is just the sum total of her delusions about who she is, who God is, a lot of doubts and judgments about him that are wrong, but maybe were at a certain point understandable, and she grasped them. And then she held tighter and tighter. And anytime someone tried to disabuse her of that, she held more tightly. Mm-hmm. Anyone threatened them, they become more important now. So her errors and her judgments, and that's a big theme, Mike, in Christian tradition, that the root, we often say like the root of sin is pride, but really the root of pride is deception.
Yeah.
Maximus is a nice triad where he says, ignorance gives birth to self-love, because the self you love is not true because you're ignorant of yourself. But ignorance gives birth to self-love. Self-love gives birth to tyranny. That's what he says. Wow. And that's because you're ignorant. When you're ignorant of God, you're ignorant of everything, including yourself. And they're mutually implicated ignorances. You can't be ignorant of one without being ignorant of all of them, world, God, and self. Just like you can't know one without knowing all of them, world, God, and self. But then if you're ignorant of self, you also love a self. You still love yourself, but the self you love isn't you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the false self stuff, the shadow, which is a big thing in Lilith.
Right.
Why is there a shadow, right? In general, there's a shadow, but there's also a shadow of certain figures. And they almost have their own kind of life. Well, the parasitic thing, you give life to a false self. So you're ignorant of yourself, but you generate a picture of yourself. That's ignorant.
And you yourself believe that.
You believe it, and you live into it, and you
Right.
even give yourself to this picture.
Sure.
And then you guard it possessively.
Yeah.
You grasp it.
Yep.
And anyone that threatens it, you become a tyrant.
Yeah.
And you go after them, and you're coercive, and you're everything Lilith is. You're murderous. And you will do anything to protect this. And the dirty little secret all along is there's nothing there to protect but your delusion. And so that's the last delusion, I think, in Lilith's judgment. She still thinks something's there.
Uh-huh.
She's so long misperceived the reality. She's so long believed an error, a falsehood. She's so long misperceived herself and everyone else. She doesn't even remember that there's nothing there.
Wow.
And so she says, I can't do it. She can. Well, it's true and it's false. She does not yet have the will.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, she's right. But also but it's not because anyone's holding it there. It's because her will is holding it there.
Yeah.
So what's so great about this moment and this symbol is she asks them to cut off her hand because she can't open it. In one sense, it's still just an extension of her basic delusion. Because she just thinks, well, if I cut it off, I can do without it, and maybe I'll heal. And so she's trying to go a different route than her own will.
Mm-hmm.
So she is actually now, after resisting and being autonomous and claiming her freedom, now all of a sudden at the end she wants to be violated.
Right.
Just cut it off. But what's great is they know at the same time, actually we will cut it off, but this will be the precondition for you. Like it'll regrow.
Yeah.
And then you will have a new will. That as Mara says, there's a light behind your that goes deeper than your own will, lights up your will behind it, makes it your own.
Yes.
So what she thinks is cut off because I need someone to make me do it now, which is the thing she's been resisting her whole life. Now, actually, what they see is she still is deceived, but this deception will lead to truth. Mm-hmm. The truth is we'll cut it off because in cutting it off, we're cutting nothing off, the nothing you grasp. Which is then your ignorance will be gone, which will allow you to know.
Yeah.
So ultimately, all of this to me is sort of what's packed into the meaning in the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Which means until you know the truth, you're enslaved. And what are you enslaved to? Well, there's different words: sin. Some church fathers talk about Satan. Ultimately, you're enslaved to delusion. Right. Self-delusion, delusion of God, delusion of the world. So that's how I read the judgment of Lilith is that process by which the truth sets her free. Mm-hmm. The last bond is her own grasp of nothingness, which is to say the last sort of strand or filament of her own delusion that she herself has made real. Mm. And so cutting it off is good. That also reminds me again of Colossians 3, cut off and bury, sever and bury the things that tend towards the earth so that the new creation can come through and Christ can be all and in all. But why she thinks that needs to happen is still itself a delusion, but it's the very delusion by which she will be brought to the truth. So it's a wonderful, it's sort of back to the Joseph story, what you intended for my harm, God intended for my good. It's like the absolute coincidence of that, the perfect instance of providence, that God saves you through you.
Right.
So somehow, as Chris was saying earlier, it's the meeting of the wills as one.
Yes. It's a mystery.
It's a total mystery, and it's a proper mystery, because if it was something you could sort of predict apart from the actual experience of the judgment, it wouldn't be about perfecting you as a person, but you as just a generic idea or an instance of some greater law. Yeah. Some greater order. But it isn't. It's about you. It's about getting to you. Yeah. There's no way to get to you except through you.
Man. Any last thoughts?
Well, man. I would just say I actually like that we have not, just on that note about having to experience, we have not said much about the final scene, like the last 20 pages of the book. Mm-hmm. I actually think that's right. I don't know about you. When I first read that, it's like an experience.
Yes.
And so there's one of those things where it's like, I almost don't want to analyze it. I don't want to break it down. I want
Yeah.
to just tell people, read it. Even if you're confused at the beginning, that's fine. Later on, when you reread it, actually, it'll be a part you really love, that the first several dialogues. But get to the end and just experience it. It's very hard for me not to think that George MacDonald didn't actually somehow experience it. I mean, some of the stuff is like, I don't want to get too speculative, but it's just like either his imagination was unbelievably palpable and potent, or he's sort of like seen it and
Yes.
describes it. So I like that we didn't touch on that final scene, but I just want to encourage everybody get there, and I think a lot of
Yes.
things will fall into place.
Perfect.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Derek.
That'll do that one.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word newfangled. Newfangled. Newfangled is an adjective, often derogatory, defined as different from what one is used to, objectively new. It's also used to describe a person who is attracted to novelty or things that are of the newest style or kind. You know, perhaps you have a friend who has many newfangled gadgets in their kitchen. They're always buying the latest newfangled piece of technological innovation. I know a person like that. Newfangled is actually a pretty old word. It dates all the way back to the 15th century and likely developed from the even older adjective newfangle, without the D, which probably derives, by the way, if you don't get vitamin D, it's very incomplete. So, like newfangle added the D, I recommend you add vitamin D to your daily regimen of supplementation, especially if you live near the North Pole, like I do. Not much sun this time of year. Back to newfangled. It derives from a combination of the Middle English new, which means new, N-E-W-E, and the Old English fangol, F-A-N-G-O-L, a verb meaning to take. So take the new. Maybe it's time for some of you to take the new. I really appreciate this encouragement from Newfangled, and I thank you, Newfangled, for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.